A sign hangs above every person's head in this world. Rank, level, sentence. There is nothing above Dan's head. The guards look right through him as if he were a wall. But first, Dan opens his eyes in a puddle. The cold of the wet stone bites into his cheek. The water reeks of rot and rust. His body won't obey him. His hands are thinner than he remembers. He brings his palms to his face and freezes. Someone else's fingers. Dirty, bony, nails broken down to the flesh. A scar on his wrist that he never had. The last thing he remembers. The steering wheel slipping from his hands on the bridge in Seattle. Asphalt splattering against the windshield. He must be dead. Instead, he's sitting in a stranger's body in a strange world. Somewhere above, two voices are shouting in a language he never learned, and he understands every word. Dan gets up. His knees are shaking. He steps out onto the street and freezes. People walk along the pavement in a mix of medieval and something more modern. Leather jackets with metal, raincoats with patches, and above each person's head, a translucent panel glows. Numbers, letters, rank, and level. The fishmonger has a D. The blacksmith has a C. The woman in the white raincoat has a B. Dan tries to summon his panel. His body knows the gesture, a slight effort of will. Nothing. Emptiness. Not even a shadow of a label hovers above his head. A patrol passes by. Two guards in dark armor scan the crowd. 1 second per person. A scan. Their gazes reach Dan and pass right through him. Not past him. Through him. As if there were only a wall and a puddle in his place. And then the pen tester inside him wakes up. The whole world runs on a single platform, with complete trust in its data. And he is the only packet that gets through the firewall because he isn't in the logs. Dan walks along the stream of people like a ghost. No one looks back. People walk around him like a pillar, and everywhere signs glow above their heads. It's a caste system. Digital. Transparent. Absolute. The blacksmith bows his head before the woman in white. A boy with an F presses himself against the wall as someone with an A walks by. And Dan is outside of all this. He turns onto the square and freezes. A silent crowd stands by the fountain. In the center, between two guards, stands a girl of about 14. Skinny. Dirty. Her hands are tied behind her back. Above her head, the rank F and a red mark glow. Bright. Pulsing. Like an alarm. People wince. They look away. They spit on the ground. A guard reads the verdict. A girl named So-Ha-Un has been found guilty of theft by the system. The mark of guilt has been imposed. Execution at dawn. No appeal. The girl isn't crying. She stands straight. Her lips are pressed together. Only her hands behind her back are trembling. No one asks what she stole or why. The red mark means a sentence. The sentence means death. Period. And this is where the strangest part begins. Dan looks at the mark and sees it differently. Not divine punishment, an entry in a database, a flag in a profile, a 1 where there should be a 0. And he doesn't have an account in that database, which means there's no access check. He doesn't think long. Thinking long is a luxury for those who have time. He squeezes through the crowd. People part without noticing him. The guards look past him. He stands in front of the girl. She looks up at him. She sees him. Not the system. Her, with ordinary human eyes. Dan places his palm on her forehead. He doesn't know exactly what he's doing, but he feels it. The way experienced pen testers sense a hole in the system even before they can describe it in words. His hand passes through an interface that wasn't designed for him and therefore can't stop him. He finds the entry. A simple flag. Guilty. Yes. He changes it to no. The red mark flashes. Once. Twice. It goes out. The crowd falls silent. The guards turn around. Above the girl's head, a blank plaque. No mark. As if it had never been there. One guard reaches for his sword. The second grabs his arm. No one in the history of this world has ever removed a guilty mark. No one. It's impossible. It's like defying gravity. The crowd buzzes. Someone falls to their knees. Someone shouts about a miracle. But Dan is already leaving. Quietly. Through the crowd. Invisible. The vulnerability of day zero in God. He tucks his hands into his pockets and disappears into an alley. Dan was running, not from anyone in particular. His legs just carried him away from the square. Instinct. He'd done something impossible, and now he had to vanish. He turned into an alley, then another, then a third. The lower tier of the city was a labyrinth of winding streets and overhanging buildings. 10 minutes later, he stopped, leaned against a wall, breathing heavily. His body was a wreck. No stamina, no strength, just an ordinary human body that had been poorly fed and never trained. He slid down the wall and sat right on the ground. His hands were shaking, not from fear, from adrenaline. He had just edited an entry in God's database, in front of hundreds of people, and walked away. Because they can't see him. Dan closed his eyes and began to gather his thoughts. Fact number 1. He is dead in his own world. Fact number 2. He is alive in this one, in the body of a homeless orphan whose fragments of memory floated in his head like debris in murky water. The name of the body's former owner was similar to his own, also Daniel, also So. Whether it was a coincidence or not, he didn't know yet. Fact number 3. There is a system here, global, total, built into reality. Every person is connected to it from birth. It assigns classes and levels and ranks. It awards experience. It judges and punishes. Fact number 4. He isn't connected to it. Not at all. The system doesn't register him. To it, he doesn't exist. And that means that all the security mechanisms the system imposes on its data do not apply to him. He can touch what must not be touched, change what cannot be changed. Because access control does not work on a user who is not on the user list. Fact 5. He just proved it. Dan opened his eyes. He had to think practically. Food, water, shelter. He was in the body of a vagrant, which meant he had nothing. No home, no money, no food. Fragments of someone else's memory suggested that the previous owner had spent the night in an abandoned warehouse by the canal. Dan got up and followed the memory that wasn't his. He found the warehouse in half an hour. An old stone building with a collapsed roof. Inside, it smelled of dampness and rotten wood. In the corner lay a pile of rags that served as a bed. Next to it stood a clay jug of murky water. Dan sat down on the rags and began to think systematically. First, he needed food, regularly. His body was on the verge of exhaustion. If he collapsed from hunger, none of his abilities would help. Second, he needed information. All he knew about the system was what he'd seen in those 2 hours on the street. That wasn't enough. He needed to understand the rules, how experience worked, how ranks worked, what rifts were, what the system could and couldn't do. Third, he needs to avoid drawing attention. What he did in the square was foolish, a beautiful, dramatic, necessary foolishness, but foolishness nonetheless. If someone starts looking for the person who removed the mark and somehow tracks him down, it will all end quickly. He's an ordinary person, mortal, no regeneration, no skills, no levels. Any powered-up fighter could kill him with a single blow. Dan spent the rest of the day in the warehouse. He found a piece of coal among the trash and started writing on the wall. Logs, the first entries. The system is visible to everyone. The panels are translucent. Ranks range from F to something higher. Levels are numerical. Classes are text-based. Labels are colored. Red means guilt. Guards read the data with a glance, so they have a scanning function built into their class or rank. Ordinary people see only what the system displays openly. Dan wrote until the coal ran out. Then he sat in the dark and thought. In the morning, he went out onto the street. He was seriously hungry. His body demanded food right now. Dan headed to the market that the body of its former owner remembered. The lower-tier market was dirty, noisy, and crowded. F and D-rank merchants sold food and junk. Shoppers haggled and argued. There were few guards here. The lower tier was clearly not a priority for those above. Dan walked past the stalls. The merchants didn't notice him. Shoppers walked around him like a pole. He could have stolen anything. Literally. Reach out and take it. No one would have noticed. The system wouldn't tag him because, to it, he didn't exist. People wouldn't see him because the system didn't highlight his presence. He took a flatbread from the counter. The vendor was looking the other way. Then an apple. Then a piece of jerky. Dan ate on the go, leaning against a wall in the shade between the stalls. The food was terrible, but his body accepted it gratefully. His head cleared. His thoughts became sharper. He spent 2 hours at the market, listening to conversations, gathering information. Snippets of other people's conversations pieced together into a picture. Fault lines are portals from which monsters emerge. The awakened go into the fault lines and kill monsters for experience. Guilds organize raids. The Church of the Luminous Algorithm considers the system a god. Our rank determines everything: work, housing, rights, marriage. If your rank is low, life is miserable. If your rank is high, the world is yours. If you have no rank, you don't exist. Dan didn't exist, and that gave him a freedom no one else had. By evening, he returned to the warehouse and froze in the doorway. A girl was sitting on his rags. So Ha-Un, the very same one, from the square. There was no tag above her head, a blank slate. Rank F, Level 1. She sat with her arms wrapped around her knees and looked at him, right at him. She saw him. Dan didn't understand how she had found him. He left no traces. The system couldn't pinpoint him. But she found him. The girl said she had been following him all the way from the square, with her own eyes, without any system. She just followed him through the streets. Because he was the only one she could see, and the guards couldn't. Dan was silent. The girl said she wouldn't leave, that she had nowhere to go, that she was supposed to be executed this morning, but now she'd escaped and the guards were looking for her. Not because of the mark. The mark is gone. But the execution papers have already been signed, and it's easier for the guards to kill her than to explain to their superiors why the system's verdict has vanished. Dan sat down across from her. He looked at her gaunt face, at her hands with rope marks on her wrists, at the eyes that were too old for a 14-year-old. He asked what she had stolen. Ha-Un replied that it was bread, 1 loaf, 3 days ago. She hadn't eaten for 5 days before that. The system had branded her with guilt instantly. For a loaf of bread. A death sentence. Dan nodded. All right, she stays. He had to deal with the guards, but that was for tomorrow. Tonight, they were both just sitting in an abandoned warehouse by the canal. Two people whom the world didn't consider human. One because the system couldn't see him. The other because the system decided she wasn't worth living. Dan looked at the wall where his first logs were written in charcoal. There would be more entries. Many more. Dan woke up to someone shaking his shoulder. Ha-un was standing over him. Her face was tense. She said there were guards outside. Dan got up instantly. His body ached after a night on the stone floor, but his mind snapped into gear immediately. He walked over to a crack in the wall and peered out. 3 guards were walking along the canal. They weren't in a hurry. They were checking every nook and cranny. Their eyes scanned the area. They were looking for a girl with an F rank and level 1 who was supposed to be dead by morning but had somehow escaped. Dan stepped back from the wall. He thought, the guards are scanning the system. That means they can see the tags above people's heads. That means they're looking for a specific profile. Rank F, level 1, female, age 14. If Ha-un goes outside, they'll spot her instantly. But if she stays here, they might check the warehouse. Dan told her to stay quiet. He went outside. The guards were 30 paces away. Dan walked toward them. He passed by. Their eyes glanced at him and moved on. He was a piece of furniture. He was a wall. He was air. Dan walked around them and headed along the canal in the opposite direction. He found a rock. He picked it up and threw it into the water far from the warehouse. Splash. The guards turned at the sound. They went to check it out. A minute later, they were far enough away. Dan returned to the warehouse and told Ha-un they needed to change their hiding place. She didn't argue. They gathered the few things they had and left. Dan led her through the alleys of the lower tier. He chose routes where there were fewer people, not because he might be seen, but because she might be. To the system, Ha-in existed. She was in the database. Any guard with a scanning function could find her. That was a problem, a serious one. They needed a hideout where the guards didn't go. Fragments of someone else's memory suggested a place. Abandoned catacombs beneath an old temple that had collapsed 30 years ago. Locals don't go there. They consider it cursed. Dan found the entrance through a gap in the foundation. Inside, it was dark and dry. Stone corridors stretched deep into the darkness. It smelled of dust, not rot. That was good. They found a room that had once been a basement storage area. Stone walls, stone floor, high ceiling. Light filtered through a crack in the wall. Dan surveyed the room. 2 exits, one through the gap they'd come through, the second through a narrow corridor that led somewhere further on. He said this was where they would live. Ha-un looked around, and for the first time in 2 days, the expression on her face was something other than tension. She said things had been worse. Dan spent the first half of the day setting up the shelter. He gathered rags for beds. He found an old water barrel. He brought food from the market. Ha-un watched as he freely took things from the stalls and was silent at first. Then she asked why no one could see him. Dan thought about his answer. He couldn't tell her the truth, not because he didn't want to, but because the truth sounded crazy. I'm from another world. I was a computer hacker. Your God is a program. Instead, he said he was born without status, that the system doesn't notice him, that he doesn't know why. It was close enough to the truth that he didn't feel like a liar. Ha-in accepted the explanation. In her world, people were born with status defects. It was rare, but it happened. Usually, it meant an early death. But complete invisibility was something new even to her. She asked how he had removed the tag. Dan said he'd simply reached out to it and removed it, as if erasing graffiti from a wall. Ha-Un was silent for a long time. Then she said that in all of history, no one had ever removed a guilt mark, that it was considered impossible, that the system's verdict was as absolute as death. Dan shrugged. He'd seen too many systems that were considered invulnerable. None of it turned out to be so. For the next 3 days, Dan established a routine. In the morning, he went out into the city. He walked through the markets and streets. He listened to conversations. He observed how the system worked. In the evening, he returned to the catacombs and wrote down his observations on the wall. He had replaced the charcoal with ink and paper he'd swiped from the scribe's shop. His logs were growing. The system awards experience only for killing monsters in the rifts, not for training, not for studying, only for the rifts. That's strange. It means the system wants people to go into the rifts. Rank is determined at awakening and grows as you gain experience, but it only grows up to a certain ceiling. Everyone has a limit. F rank can reach a maximum of mid-E. The ceiling is set by the system at birth and does not change. That's strange, too. It means the system decides in advance who is worth what. Classes determine a set of skills: warrior, mage, healer, scout, and dozens of subclasses. Class is also set at birth. You can't change it. You can't choose it. Dan recorded and saw the pattern. The system controlled everything. It didn't just observe, it controlled. It decided who would be strong. It decided who would be weak. It decided who was guilty. And everyone accepted this as a law of nature. Because it had worked for 200 years, and because there was no one who could look at the system from the outside. Until now. On the 4th day, Dan returned to the shelter and found Ha-Un sitting against the wall. She was looking at her tag. Dan saw what she saw. Rank F, Level 1, Class Frozen. The last 3 words glowed a dull gray. Class Frozen. Ha-Un said her class had been blocked when she was 10, after the first mark. Not a mark of guilt. Markings of suspicion. She was an orphan living on the streets, and the system had flagged her as a potential offender. After that, her class was frozen. She couldn't develop, couldn't gain skills, couldn't grow. She was permanently locked at Level 1 with a frozen class. In a world where level determines everything, this was a life sentence. Worse, it was a death sentence in installments. Without a class or level, she couldn't work. She couldn't join a guild. She couldn't do anything but steal and survive. And for stealing, the system tagged her as guilty. A vicious cycle. Dan looked at the gray letters above her head. Class frozen. For any inhabitant of this world, it was a divine sentence. End of discussion. For Dan, it was a bug. Just another flag in the database. Just another line of code that could be rewritten. He told Ha-Un he'd fix it. She looked at him as if he'd promised to stop the sun. Fixing Ha-Un's class turned out to be not as simple as removing the guilt tag. The tag was just a flag. A switch. Yes or no. Guilty or not guilty. Freezing the class was something else entirely. Dan spent 2 days trying to figure it out. He would sit next to Ha-Un and put his hand on her shoulder. He reached for her status, just like he had back in the square. And he found himself facing something complex. If the mark was like a line in a text file, then the class freeze was like an encrypted database section with 3 levels of nesting. Dan closed his eyes and tried to feel out the structure. Ha-Un sat motionless. She didn't understand what he was doing, but she didn't interfere. He read the first level quickly. General information. Class, Scout. Subclass, Shadow Tracker. Base stats that had never been developed because the class had been frozen before activation. It would have been a good class. Speed, stealth, keen senses, but all of this was locked behind a gray lock. The second level was deeper. The freeze conditions were stored here. Dan pored over them as if they were the code of a foreign program. Freeze trigger, suspicion flag plus age under 12 plus no guardian. 3 conditions. All 3 matched, and the system automatically blocked development. Not a judge decided, not a human. An automated script. An algorithm that decided an orphan with a suspicion flag was unworthy of development. Dan clenched his teeth. He'd seen this before, in a past life. Automated systems that make decisions about people based on primitive rules. Credit scoring that rejects you because you live in a poor neighborhood. A hiring algorithm that rejects a resume because the name doesn't sound right. Same old story, different world. The third level was the deepest. This is where the freeze mechanism itself was stored. And this is where Dan got stuck. The mechanism wasn't just a flag that could be toggled. It was an active lock. It refreshed with every system cycle. Every few seconds, the system checked Ha-Un's status and reconfirmed the freeze. Even if Dan removed the lock, the system would put it back in seconds. A different approach was needed. Dan let go of her shoulder and sat down to think. Ha-Un asked if he'd figured it out. He said not yet, but he would. He spent the night thinking. The problem was a classic one. The system checks the conditions and applies the rule. The conditions are still met. Ha-Un is still an orphan. She's still not 12 in the records. The suspicion flag is still listed in her history. He needed to remove not the result, but the cause. Not the freeze, but the conditions that trigger it. In the morning, Dan sat down next to Ha-Un again. He said it would take a while. She nodded. He put his hand on her shoulder and dove into her status. He found the second level, the freeze conditions, the suspicion tag. He found it in her profile history, an old entry from 4 years ago. He deleted it, just like he'd erased the guilt tag in the square. He simply deleted the line. Then he checked. Condition 1, suspicion tag, gone. Condition 2, age under 12. Ha-Un was already 14. That condition wasn't met. Condition 3, absence of a guardian. Dan thought for a moment. In Ha-Un's profile, the guardian field was blank. She had been an orphan her whole life. Dan reached for that field. He wasn't sure it would work, but it was worth a try. He typed his name there. Daniel So. The system couldn't verify his information because his information wasn't in the system. It couldn't confirm that he existed, but it couldn't deny it either. The field was no longer empty. That was enough. 3 conditions. The first is not met. The second is not met. The third is not met. The freeze trigger is reset. Dan moved to the third level and waited. The system's next cycle came 4 seconds later. The system checked the freeze conditions for So Ha-Un's profile. None were met. The system lifted the lock. Dan opened his eyes. Ha-Un sat with her eyes wide open. Above her head, the label was changing. The gray letters were filling with color. Class. Shadow Tracker. Active. She raised her hands and looked at them as if she were seeing them for the first time. A light mist ran over her fingers. Skill. The first skill she was supposed to have received at age 10, but never did. It had activated on its own. Shadow Step. The ability to accelerate over short distances while becoming semi-transparent. Ha-Un leapt to her feet. She flickered. She found herself at the other end of the room. Dan blinked. She was fast. Very fast. Even at level 1, with a class she'd just unlocked, she moved so fast his eyes couldn't keep up with her. Ha-Un stood by the far wall, breathing heavily. Her eyes were shining, not from tears, from something more. For the first time since he'd been here, Dan smiled. Not just on the inside. For real. Ha-un said quietly that for 4 years she'd considered herself broken, defective, system trash with no place in the world. Dan replied that the system was wrong, that she wasn't what the system had written about her. She stood by the wall and was silent for a long time. Then she said he was the first person to think that. They spent the rest of the day in the catacombs. Ha-un explored her class, ran through the corridors, disappeared and reappeared. She laughed. Dan sat and wrote logs. Class freezing is an automatic script. 3 conditions. All can be bypassed. The system doesn't verify data entered by an invisible user. It accepts it as valid because it can't determine the source. Vulnerability confirmed. He noted this and underlined it. But he noted something else as well. Every intervention in someone else's status is a risk. The system hasn't noticed the changes yet because they're minor. 1 tag, 1 freeze. But if the changes become more frequent, the system might start noticing anomalies in its data and start looking for the source. Dan had to be careful. Every fix brought him closer to the moment when the system would realize that someone was tampering with its code. That evening, when Ha-in finally grew tired and went to sleep, Dan sat against the wall and looked at his notes. 2 weeks in this world. A refuge, an ally, understanding the basic rules, the ability to change others' statuses. It was more than he'd expected. But it wasn't enough. The lower tier was rock bottom. This is where those cast aside by the system lived. F and D ranks. The poor, the homeless, criminals, people with no future. Dan could help one Ha-un, but there were thousands like her all around. Branded, frozen, doomed. He couldn't fix them all, not now, but he could start. For the next 2 weeks, Dan went out into the city every day. He expanded his area of observation. The lower tier was vast. Thousands of people lived in a labyrinth of streets beneath the shadow of the upper tier, which loomed over them like a stone cloud. The upper tier stood on columns and platforms. That's where the high-ranking lived. Light fell from there. Down below, it was always gloomy. Dan walked through the slums like a ghost. He observed, he took notes, he learned. He began to notice patterns he hadn't seen during the first week. The system was updating. Not constantly, in cycles. He noticed the pattern. Every 6 hours, a major update cycle occurred. At that moment, all the panels above their heads flickered simultaneously. Levels were updated, experience was awarded, buffs and debuffs were adjusted. Between cycles, there were small updates, every 4 seconds. Checking active statuses, checking tags, checking location. Dan counted the seconds between the small cycles and wrote them down. 4 seconds, consistently. This was important. It meant there was a window between checks, small but real. If you needed to do something unnoticed, it was best to do it right after a small cycle, 4 seconds until the next check. In the 3rd week, Ha-in came to him with news. She had been wandering around the lower tier while Dan was on surveillance and had found someone, a woman named Evelyn Cho. Ha-in knew her from before. Evelyn ran something like a shelter for low-ranking people, a small guild that was officially listed as a D-rank organization for gathering resources in lower-class rifts. In reality, it was a refuge for those the system had written off. Old people with frozen ranks, orphans, disabled people whose statuses had been corrupted, people who had suffered the same fate as Ha-in, only no one had helped them. Dan agreed to go. They found Evelyn's guild in the basement of a former tavern. The sign outside read, "The Last Step." It was cramped inside. 12 people. Most were F rank, a few D ranks. Evelyn Cho stood behind the counter, assigning the day's tasks. She was 27, tall, a harsh face, dark circles under her eyes. C rank, level 34. She was the only one with a decent rank in the whole group, and she was carrying everyone else. When Dan walked in, Evelyn didn't notice him. Neither did anyone else except Ha-un. Dan stood in the corner and watched. Evelyn was handing out assignments. Her voice was steady. Her hands were steady. But Dan saw what the system didn't show: a tremor in her fingers, slowed reactions, micro-pauses between words when she forgot what she wanted to say. Evelyn Cho was on the brink. She had been dragging 12 people along for years and was breaking under the weight. Ha-in approached Evelyn and spoke to her. Evelyn stared at her nameplate. Shadow Tracker class. Active. She remembered Ha-in. She remembered that the class had been frozen. Her eyes widened. Ha-in said she had a friend who could help. Evelyn asked where this friend was. Ha-in pointed at Dan. Evelyn looked over and saw nothing. Ha-in took Dan by the hand and led him over to Evelyn. Physical contact helped. When someone touched Dan and at the same time looked at the spot where he was standing, the brain began to register him. Not immediately. Slowly. As if her eyes were resisting what they were seeing. Evelyn blinked. Then again. And finally saw him. A skinny, dirty guy in his early 20s. No panel above his head. Nothing. Emptiness. Evelyn took a step back. Her hand reached for the knife on her belt. In her world, a person without status was an anomaly, a mistake, something that shouldn't exist. Ha-un spoke up quickly. She told her how Dan had removed the guilt mark from her, how he'd unlocked her class, how she'd been frozen for 4 years and could now develop again. Evelyn listened. Her hand slowly released the knife. She looked at Dan for a long time. Then she asked one thing. Could he really remove class freezes? Dan said it depended on the type of block, but he had removed the guilt mark. He had removed the freeze. Perhaps he could do the other things too. Evelyn was silent for a full minute. Then she said she had 9 people with blocked or damaged statuses. 9 people who couldn't live normal lives, couldn't work, couldn't develop. The system had written them off, and they were slowly dying. Not physically, mentally. Losing their will. They're losing their purpose. She saw this every day and couldn't do anything about it. Dan understood that every intervention was a risk. Every change in the database was a potential signal to the system. It was one thing to remove a tag from a single girl. It was another to fix 9 people. It would be noticeable. But he looked at Evelyn, at the tremor in her hands, at the dark circles under her eyes, at the 12 people in the cramped basement who looked to her as their only hope. And he realized that caution wasn't the only value. Dan said he needed time. He wouldn't fix everyone at once, one at a time, with breaks in between, so the system wouldn't detect a pattern of mass changes. Evelyn nodded. She was a pragmatist. She understood the logic. The first patient was an old man named Moon, 62 years old, rank F, level 8, class, artisan, status, damaged. A system error during an update 10 years ago had reset half of his skills. He was a watchmaker, the best in the lower tier. After the glitch, he couldn't even fix a simple mechanism. His hands remembered, but the skills had been erased, and the system wouldn't let him do anything for which he lacked the corresponding skill. Dan sat down next to the old man. He placed a hand on his shoulder. He dove into the status. The structure was different, not a freeze. Damage. Part of the data had simply vanished, like bad sectors on a disk. The skills weren't locked. They had been deleted. Dan couldn't restore what wasn't there, but he could examine the architecture of the skills, understand how they were structured, and try to recreate them. This was the most difficult thing he'd ever done. A skill isn't a flag or a line of text. A skill is a structure, a set of interconnected parameters, activation conditions, modifiers, dependencies on attributes. Dan dissected the old man's remaining skills as samples. He studied their structure. He looked for a pattern. He found it. The artisan class skills were built according to a single template. Dan took this template and began reconstructing the lost skills by analogy. It took 4 hours. Dan emerged from the trance with a headache so severe his vision went dark. Old Man Moon sat and looked at his hands. Then he stood up silently. He walked over to the workbench standing in the corner of the basement. He picked up the broken mechanism that had been lying there for months and began to take it apart. His fingers moved precisely, confidently, just like 10 years ago. 20 minutes later, the mechanism was ticking. Moon placed it on the table and stared at it intently. His hands weren't shaking. For the first time in 10 years. Evelyn stood nearby, clenching her fists so tightly that her nails dug into her palms. She wasn't crying. She didn't know how to cry in front of people. But Dan saw how the muscles in her jaw tensed and how she turned away for a second. Dan said he'd take the next one in 3 days. The system needed time. We need to make sure the changes haven't raised any alarms. Evelyn nodded. Then she asked his name. He said, Dan. Just Dan. Evelyn said she'd remember that name. For 3 days, Dan didn't touch anyone's statuses. He observed. He walked through the lower tier and monitored the system's behavior. He looked for any signs that his interventions had been noticed. Nothing. No anomalies. The panels above their heads flickered in their usual rhythm. Guards patrolled on schedule. Major refresh cycles ran every 6 hours like clockwork, minor ones every 4 seconds. Dan recorded and counted. 3 changes in 3 weeks. Ha-In's mark. Ha-In's freeze. Moon's skills. 3 dots on a map of millions of profiles, a drop in the ocean. The system didn't notice. Yet. On the 4th day, he returned to the last step and took on the second target, a woman named Park Yuri, 41 years old, rank F, level 5, class herbalist. The debuff imposed by the system for a violation she didn't commit couldn't be removed. 15 years ago, she treated who turned out to be a fugitive. The system marked her as an accomplice. The debuff halved all her stats. A herbalist who couldn't tell medicinal herbs from weeds because the system had cut her perception in half. Dan dove into her status. The debuff worked differently than a tag or a freeze. It was an active effect. It didn't just hang in the profile, it constantly consumed system resources. Every small cycle, the system spent a portion of its processing power maintaining the debuff. Dan studied its structure. He found the anchor, the point of attachment to the profile, and he unhooked the anchor. The debuff lost its anchor and crumbled. In the next small cycle, the system couldn't find anything to attach it to and simply deleted it as junk data. Yuri blinked. She looked at her hands, then at the table where the dried herbs lay that Evelyn kept for bartering. Yuri picked up a bunch and brought it to her face. She sniffed it. Her eyes widened. She said she could smell it. A real smell, not muffled, not blurred, full. For 15 years, she had lived as if the whole world were behind a cloudy glass. And the glass had vanished. Dan logged it. Debuff is anchored. The anchor can be unhooked. The system automatically disposes of unanchored effects. Another vulnerability. He waited 4 days before the next one. Then he fixed a guy named Tarek, 20 years old, rank F, level 3, shield bearer class. A system error upon awakening gave him a class that didn't match his stats. Tarek was fast and agile, but the system classified him as a tank. His body couldn't handle the strain the class required. Every time he tried to use his shield skills, his muscles would tear. He lived with chronic pain. Dan studied his status for a long time. Changing classes was impossible. The class was hardwired deeper than anything else. It was a fundamental entry. Touch it, and the entire profile structure could collapse. But Dan found another way. The class architecture included load distribution modifiers. They determined which stats the class prioritized. By default, the shield bearer emphasized strength and stamina. Dan reconfigured the modifiers. He redirected the load to agility and speed, which were high in Tarek. The result was strange. Tarek remained a shield bearer, but his shield skills now relied on dodging and speed rather than brute force. The shield in his hands was no longer a wall, but a tool for redirection. Tarek tested his skills in the basement and laughed. For the first time, the shield didn't hurt him. For the first time, he could actually use it. Evelyn watched this, and Dan saw something change in her face. Not hope. She had stopped hoping too long ago. Something else. Maybe just the fact that she was no longer alone. That someone else stood between her people and the system that had written them off. Dan worked slowly, one person every 3 or 4 days. Between sessions, he kept his logs. His observations multiplied. He noticed that the rifts opened on a schedule, not by chance. The system controlled their appearance. Small rifts in the lower tier once a week, medium ones in the middle tier once every 2 weeks, large ones in the upper tier once a month. Like farming grounds. The system was creating content for its users. Dan wrote this down in bold letters and circled it. The system doesn't protect people from monsters. The system produces monsters for people. That was an important conclusion. It changed everything. If the system creates the rifts itself, then it isn't divine protection. It's a threat generator that is simultaneously the only means of protection against those threats. A classic scheme. Create the problem and sell the solution. Dan was thinking about this when Ha-In approached him. She had changed over the past few weeks. Her activated class had given her a boost. She had been training every day in the catacombs. Her level had risen to 3. Her skills had developed. Shadow Step had become faster and longer. A second skill had appeared, Blind Spot. The ability to create a small area where the system's scanning functioned poorly. Not complete invisibility like Dan's, but an interference, noise in the data. Ha-Yun said she wanted to help, not just sit in the catacombs, but do something. She knew the lower tier better than anyone. Every alleyway, every dead end, every rooftop. She could be his eyes and ears where he couldn't make it. Dan agreed, but he set a condition. No risk. If guards are nearby, she leaves. If something seems strange, she leaves. Her life is worth more than any information. Ha-Un rolled her eyes but nodded. The next day, she brought back information that changed the course of events. At the lower-tier market, she overheard a conversation between 2 guards. They were discussing an order from above. The Church of the Luminous Algorithm had taken an interest in the incident in the square, the mark of guilt that had vanished. They had sent an investigator, not an ordinary guard, an inquisitor. Ha-In didn't know the details, but she remembered the name. Inquisitor Marcus Val, rank A, specialization, detection of heresy and systemic anomalies. Dan listened and felt a chill run down his spine. A month. He'd had a month of relative peace, and now someone had started digging. An A-rank inquisitor isn't a guard. It's a hunter, a professional, a person whose job is to find what shouldn't exist. Dan asked Ha'un what she knew about the Church of the Algorithm. Not much. The Church considers the system to be a god. The Inquisitors are its punishing hand. They find those who violate the system's order and destroy them. They don't judge, they destroy. For the Church, the removal of the mark of guilt is no miracle. It is heresy. Someone dared to change God's verdict. This crime is worse than murder. Dan sat in the catacombs and thought. The Inquisitor will search for the one who removed the mark. He will come to the square. He will question witnesses. The witnesses will say that the mark simply vanished. No one saw Dan. No one can describe him. For the Inquisitor, it will be a mystery. But an A-rank Inquisitor won't stop at a mystery. He'll dig deeper. He'll find Ha'un, sooner or later. She is the only link between the miracle in the square and Dan. They needed to be prepared. Dan stood up and went to Evelyn. He told her that trouble was coming. He explained the situation. The Church is looking for the one who removed the mark. If they find him, they'll find everyone he's healed. And that means they'll find the last step. Evelyn listened without interrupting. Then she asked what he suggested. Dan said they needed information. They needed to know where the Inquisitor was, what he was doing, who he was talking to, where he's going. We need eyes on the streets. Evelyn nodded. She had connections. Small-time merchants, beggars, street kids, people nobody notices. They can keep an eye on the Inquisitor. For the first time, Dan felt something forming around him. Not an army, not an organization. Something more subtle. A network. People who were invisible to the world because the world considered them trash. But invisible people see more than anyone else, because no one looks at them. Inquisitor Marcus Val arrived in the lower tier 3 days later. Dan didn't see him in person, but Evelyn's network was working. A young messenger boy named Ron ran into the last step with a report. A tall man in a white cloak with a gold trim. Rank A, level 89, Algorithm Inquisitor class, accompanied by 4 B-rank guards. He started at the square. He stood in the spot where Ha'un had stood with her hands bound, doing something with his hands. Ron said the Inquisitor was moving his palms through the air as if feeling for something invisible. Dan understood. The Inquisitor was scanning residual data. Every action of the system leaves a trace. The mark of guilt had been imposed by the system, and the mark of guilt had been removed. Somewhere in the data of the plaza, an imprint of this removal remained. The question was what exactly the Inquisitor could read from this imprint. Dan sat in the catacombs and ran through the possibilities. He left no trace in the system because, to the system, he does not exist. But he left the absence of a trace, a hole, a void. The mark was there, then the mark was gone. Between these two states, there must be an action, and an action must have a source. If there is no source in the data, the Inquisitor will see the impossible, a change without a cause, an effect without an action. For a person who believes in a God system, this would be either a miracle or heresy, and Marcus Val is an Inquisitor. His job is to decide what constitutes heresy. For the next 2 days, Evelyn's network tracked Marcus's every move. He questioned witnesses in the square. He scanned the surrounding buildings. He checked the guards' logs. He spoke with merchants. No one could tell him anything useful. No one had seen Dan. The tag had simply vanished. To the witnesses, it was a miracle. To Marcus, it was an anomaly. On the third day, Marcus changed tactics. He stopped looking for the person who had removed the tag. Instead, he began looking for the one from whom the tag had been removed. Ha-Un. Dan found out about this an hour after Marcus requested the girl's records from the city guard. A boy named Ron overheard a guard complaining to his partner that the Inquisitor was demanding a file on some low-ranking rat. Dan acted quickly. Ha-In had to be hidden, not just physically, systematically. An A-rank Inquisitor could scan people from a distance. If he got close enough to Ha-In, he would see her profile, and he would see that there was no mark of guilt, even though according to the guard's data there should be one. And he would see that her class had been unfrozen, even though that couldn't be. Every change Dan had made would scream out. Dan sat and thought. Then he sat down next to Ha-In and asked for permission. She nodded. He dove into her status, not to fix it, to hide it. He found the change history, profile log. Every status change was recorded. Tag applied, date. Tag removed, date. Class unfrozen, date. Guardian added, date. It was all there, in black and white. Dan got to work. It wasn't possible to delete the entries directly. The log was protected, but Dan found another way. He didn't delete the entries, he changed their dates. He moved the removal of the tag back 4 years. He moved the class unfreezing to the same date. He made it so that, according to the profile data, the tag had been removed and the class unfrozen long ago. 4 years ago. A system correction. Automatic. Nothing unusual. The system sometimes corrected errors on its own. Rarely, but it was documented. A false history. Fake dates. The Inquisitor would see the profile of a girl who had a system autocorrection 4 years ago. An anomaly, but not a recent one. Unrelated to the event in the square. Dan logged out of the status and exhaled. The headache was intense. He lay on the stone floor and waited for the spinning in his vision to stop. Ha-Un sat beside him. She was silent. Then she quietly asked if this would make him feel worse. Dan said the headache would go away. She wasn't talking about the headache. She was talking about what he was doing to himself for the sake of others. Every time he dove into someone else's status, it was harder than the last. His body couldn't handle it. Dan didn't answer. For the next 5 days, Dan covered his tracks. He went through the profiles of everyone he'd fixed. Yuri, Tarek, Moon. For each of them, he changed the modification dates in the logs. He spread them out across different months and years. He made it so that every fix looked like a long-ago system autocorrection. Routine. Nothing interesting. It cost him 5 days of headaches and nosebleeds, which he hid from Ha-Un. Not very successfully. She saw the bloodstains on his sleeve and pressed her lips together, but said nothing. Meanwhile, Marcus Val continued his investigation. Evelyn's network reported daily. The Inquisitor hadn't found Ha-In. She was sitting in the catacombs and wouldn't come out. Marcus expanded the search. He began scanning the inhabitants of the lower tier en masse. He walked the streets, his gaze lingering on everyone. He was looking for anomalies. The low-ranking ones shied away from him. His presence was physically oppressive. A-rank, level 89. His very existence nearby made the F-ranks feel like insects. Dan went out onto the street one day when Marcus was in lower tier. He wanted to see the Inquisitor in person. He found him at the market. Marcus Val was tall, thin. His face was carved from stone. His eyes were light and unmoving. He walked through the market, and people parted before him like water before a rock. His guards followed behind. Marcus looked, scanned. His eyes moved slowly and methodically, from left to right, row by row. like a barcode scanner. Dan stood 3 steps away from him. Marcus walked past. His gaze passed through Dan as if through air. Nothing. The A-rank Inquisitor couldn't see him. Dan stood there, staring at his back. This man was dangerous. Very dangerous. But he was predictable. His methods were standard. Scanning, interrogations, analysis of system data. Everything by the book. Everything by the instructions. Marcus Val operated within the system, and Dan stood outside its boundaries. And as long as that was the case, the Inquisitor wouldn't find anything. But Dan understood that Marcus wouldn't go away. The anomaly in the square was real. The Inquisitor wouldn't rest until he found the answer. And sooner or later, he would start looking not in the system data, but beyond it. Dan returned to the catacombs and sat down at the logs. He needed to think 2 steps ahead. A week had passed. Marcus hadn't left. He was methodically combing through the lower tier, square by square, interrogating beggars, scanning vagrants, checking abandoned buildings. His guards were combing the sewers and basements. Evelyn's network kept him in the loop. Every morning, Dan received a report on the Inquisitor's movements from the previous day. Marcus was closing in on the catacombs. Not purposefully. He was just combing through everything. Sooner or later, he'd reach the old temple. And if he went inside, he'd find 12 people with suspiciously fresh autocorrections in their profiles. Dan made a decision. They needed to move the base. Not temporarily. Permanently. He discussed it with Evelyn. She said she knew a place, an old mine shaft beneath the western wall of the lower tier, abandoned for 50 years. The entrance is blocked, but Tarek, with his shield skills, could clear a passage. Deep. Far from the patrol routes. The guards wouldn't venture in there. The move took 2 days, at night. Dan led the way, checking the route. Ha-In covered the flanks. Evelyn led the group. 12 people carried everything they could manage. Tarek cleared the entrance in an hour. The mine turned out to be vast. A network of tunnels and chambers carved into the rock. Cool. There's an underground water source. Dan surveyed the space and mentally mapped out a plan. Living quarters, storage, a work area for Moon, a training hall for Ha-In and Tarek, a place for logs. It was a home. The first real home for these people in a long time. Evelyn assigned duties. Yuri set out to gather herbs in the underground grottos. Moon set up a workshop. Ha-In took on reconnaissance. Tarek guarded the entrance. Dan watched this and saw a system. Not that system. His own. A human one. A small community that was starting to function. Everyone in their place. Everyone doing what they knew how to do. No ranks, no levels. Just people. On the 3rd day after the move, Evelyn came to Dan, alone, with no witnesses. She sat across from him and was silent for a minute. Then she said she needed to talk. Not about strategy, not about Marcus. About herself. Dan waited. Evelyn said she was C rank, level 34. Guardian Commander class. A good class. A high rank for the lower tier. She could have gone up to a normal guild, to a normal life. But she stayed. 7 years ago, she found the first of her people. Old Man Moon. Sitting on the street with empty eyes, counting the days. She took him in. Then the second. Then the third. Now there are 12. For 7 years, she was the only shield between them and a world that considered them trash. And she was tired. Not physically. Deeper. She said that every morning she woke up and her first thought wasn't what she needed to do, but why? Why if the system is stronger anyway? Why if she's alone? Why, if everyone she saves from the streets can be crushed by the system with a single update? Dan listened. He didn't interrupt. Evelyn said that when he fixed Moon, she felt for the first time in years that things could be different, that the system wasn't final, that sentences could be overturned. And it was both the best and the scariest thing that had ever happened to her. The best because there was hope. The scariest because now there was something to lose. Dan thought before answering. Then he told her one thing. She was carrying 12 people on her own. Now, she wasn't alone. And he wasn't asking her to stop carrying that burden. He was asking her to let him take a share of it. Evelyn was silent for a long time. Then she nodded, once, briefly. She stood up and left. Dan noticed that the tremor in her hands had lessened slightly. The next day, news came from Ha'in. Marcus had searched the catacombs beneath the old temple. He found signs that people had been there. Rags, charred markings on the walls, food scraps. Dan felt a chill in his stomach. Markings on the walls. His logs. Early observations about the system. He hadn't erased them when they left. It had been a mistake, a gross one, an unforgivable one. Ha'un said Marcus had spent 3 hours in the catacombs. His guards had photographed the inscriptions. The Inquisitor had stood before the wall and read. Dan imagined exactly what he had seen. Observations about renewal cycles. Timings. The structure of small and large cycles. Notes on how tags and freezes work. To an ordinary person, it was gibberish, a jumble of incomprehensible words and numbers. To a Class A Inquisitor, it was a golden key. These were the notes of someone who studied the system, did not pray to it, did not worship it, studied it, like a mechanism, like a machine. To the Church of the Algorithm, it was heresy in its purest form. Marcus now knew that in the lower tier there was someone who viewed God as a puzzle. He didn't know who, he didn't know where, but he knew that this someone existed, and that he was here. Dan sat in the shaft, angry at himself. 20 years in information security, and he'd left logs on the wall. Like a rookie, like an idiot. Because he was used to a digital world where data could be deleted. But here, the data was as permanent as stone, physical, indelible. A mistake had been made. He had to deal with the consequences. Marcus would now be looking for the author of the inscriptions. He knows the author lived in the catacombs. He knows the author studied the system. He knows the author is gone. But he doesn't know who it is, and he can't track them down. Because the author isn't in the system. Dan had to use this time. While Marcus searches for a phantom, Dan has to get stronger. Not physically, strategically. He needed to know more, be able to do more, understand more about how this world works. And for that, he needed people. Not just low-ranking survivors, people with real knowledge, with access to information that can't be obtained in the slums. Dan took out his notes, new ones, on paper, which he would never leave unattended again. And he began planning his next move. The information found him before he found it. On the 4th day after moving to the mine, Ha'un returned from reconnaissance not alone. Following her was a girl in a gray hooded cloak. Rank B, level 44, class, Algorithm Priestess. Status, excommunicated. Dan saw a red seal on her profile, not a mark of guilt, something else. A seal of excommunication. The church had expelled her from its ranks. The girl's name was Lena, 21 years old, pale face, dark eyes. Her hands clenched the edges of her cloak so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Ha-In said she'd found her in an alley near the southern market. Lena was hiding, not from the guards, from the church. The inquisitors weren't just looking for Dan, they were looking for her too. Dan told Lena to sit down. She sat on a stone ledge and was silent for a while. Then she spoke, quietly, monotonously, like someone who had repeated this story in her head so many times that the words had lost their flavor. Lena was a priestess of the third circle, not the highest rank in the church, but a significant one. She served in the temple of the lower tier. She performed rituals. She healed the faithful. She confirmed the system's verdicts. When the system imposed a mark of guilt, the priestess would come and explain to the parishioners that this was God's will, that the verdict was just, that to doubt meant to sin. Lena believed this, sincerely. For 21 years, she believed that the system was God, that every mark was justice, that every verdict was deserved. 3 months ago, the system gave her a quest, a personal one, a direct one. Quests from the system were rare for priests. Usually they went to heroes in the rifts, but sometimes the system addressed the faithful directly. The quest was simple: to cast a curse on a man named Han Jae-ho, a merchant, rank D, level 12, no crime listed. The system didn't explain why. It simply ordered her to curse him. Lena went to the merchant. She looked at him, a middle-aged man, a calm face, a clean record, not a single mark, not a single violation. A wife, 2 children, a small stall at the market. Lena stood before him and couldn't raise her hand. She asked the system to explain why. The system didn't answer. She asked again. Silence. The third time, she phrased her request as a formal appeal by a third circle priestess with the right to an explanation of a divine command. The system answered with a single word: necessary. Lena cast the curse. She obeyed, because it is God, because God does not err, because 21 years of faith cannot be undone by a single doubt. Han Jae-ho died a week later. The curse destroyed his health. His wife was left alone with 2 children. The stall closed. The family ended up on the street. Lena watched over them, from afar, every day. She watched as the merchant's wife sold off their last possessions, as the children grew thin, as the woman stood by the fountain and stared into the water for too long. A month later, Lena went to the temple and took off her vestments. The high priest asked why. She said that God had killed an innocent man, that she had been a tool, that she couldn't do it anymore. The church excommunicated her that very day. The seal of defrocking, a ban on using priestly skills, a ban on entering any temple, a ban on receiving the system's blessings. For a priestess, it was like having her hands cut off. Half of her abilities stopped working. She became crippled. Lena fell silent. Dan looked at her, at the excommunication seal on her profile, at her locked abilities, at her lifeless eyes. He asked why she had told him this. Lena said that Ha-Un had told her about a man who lifts the system's sentences. Lena hadn't come so he could remove the seal from her. She had come because she wanted to understand. If he could change the system's decisions, then the system wasn't God. That meant it could be challenged. That meant Han Jae-ho hadn't died by the will of a higher being, but by the program's order. Lena wanted to know the truth. Dan thought. Lena was a priestess. She knew the inner workings of the church, the rituals, the hierarchy, the protocols. She knew how the church interacted directly with the system. That was exactly the information he needed. But Lena was also a risk. The church was looking for her. If the Inquisitors found an excommunicated person in the company of people with suspicious profiles, it would connect the dots. Dan weighed the options, risk versus value. Value won out. He told Lena she could stay, but first he had to remove the beacon from her. Lena didn't understand. Dan explained. An excommunicated person's mark isn't just a brand, it's a tracker. Through the mark, the church knows where all the excommunicated are. That's how they control those who have left. Lena turned pale. She hadn't known. Dan placed his hand on her shoulder and dove into her status. The mark was complex, multi-layered. Church tags differed from standard system ones. They were embedded deeper, with additional protection, as if whoever created them knew the system structure better than ordinary users. Dan worked for an hour, layer by layer, separating the seal from the profile, finding hidden links. He cut the threads that stretched upward somewhere, to the church's server, to the Inquisition's central hub. When he finished, the seal flickered and vanished. Lena flinched, then froze. She raised her hand. A soft light flashed above her palm, the minor healing skill. Blocked by the church, now free. Lena stared at the light, her lips trembling. Dan stood up and stepped aside. The headache was intense. Blood from his nose dripped onto his shirt. He pressed the sleeve to his face and sat down against the wall. Ha-Un was already by his side. She silently handed him a rag. Dan took it. He was getting used to the fact that every serious intervention cost him blood. Literally. His body was paying for what his mind was doing with other people's data. No levels, no regeneration, no buffs. Just a human body that was slowly wearing out. Lena approached him a few minutes later. Her hands glowed with a soft golden light. She said she could heal him. Dan let her. The light touched his temples. The pain receded. Not completely, but enough for him to think clearly. Lena said this was the first time she'd used healing of her own free will, not by order of the system, not by church protocol, simply because she wanted to help. That evening, Dan sat with Lena and asked her about the church. She knew a lot. The Church of the Luminous Algorithm was not just a religious organization. It was an interface, a bridge between the system and people. The priests had a direct line of communication with the system. They could receive quests directly. They could bestow blessings and curses on behalf of the system. They could read deep layers of statuses. And most importantly, the church had archives. Records spanning 200 years, from the moment the system appeared. Lena didn't have personal access to the archives. A third circle priestess wasn't allowed above the second tier of the vault. But she knew the archives existed, and she knew where they were. The main temple, the upper tier, the underground levels. Dan was taking notes. The church's archives are the place where there might be records of previous invisibles, about past nobodies. If the system had created others like him before and purged them, the church must have documented it. The Inquisitors dealt with anomalies. A person invisible to the system is an anomaly. Somewhere in those archives, there are reports. Dan now knew where he needed to go. The question was, how? Dan needed a plan to infiltrate the archives of the main temple. But first, he needed information. The building's layout, the guards' schedule, the security systems, access levels. Lena knew the general layout, but not the details. She had served in the temple of the lower tier. The main temple of the upper tier was a different world. Security was far more serious. High-ranking priests, inquisitors, possibly even SS-ranking officers. Dan couldn't just walk in and take what he needed. Invisibility to the system didn't mean invisibility to physical locks and stone walls. He needed a team, reconnaissance, support, and someone who knew the upper tier from the inside. The answer came 2 days later. Ha-In brought back a rumor from the market. A newcomer had appeared in the lower tier, a girl who didn't fit in. Her clothes were too clean. Her gait was too confident. She smelled too good for the slums. She was looking for someone, asking about a man who removes tags. Dan tensed. It could be a trap, a plant from Marcus. He told Ha-Un to watch, but not make contact. For 2 days, Ha-Un followed the girl. She managed to find out her name. Madison Wright, 20 years old, rank C, level 29, mnemonic class. A rare class, perfect memory, a complete record of everything she saw, heard, and felt. Dan was intrigued. Mnemonic. That explained why she was here. A person with perfect memory in a world where the system can read memories during a scan. She has no privacy. Every guard can look into her head and see everything she has seen. Every secret, every moment, every thought tied to a memory. To the system, she was an open book. Dan sent Ha-In to make contact, carefully. Ha-In approached Madison at the market and asked who she was looking for. Madison said she was looking for a ghost, a person without status who carries out sentences. Ha-In asked why. Madison paused and said she wanted a secret. Ha-Un didn't understand. Madison explained. Her whole life, she had been transparent. Anyone with a high enough rank could scan her and see her memories. Friends, family, relationships. Everything she had experienced didn't belong to her, but to the system. She couldn't have secrets. She couldn't have anything of her own. She had heard of a person the system couldn't see, and she thought that near him there might be a place the system couldn't see either, a place where her memories would belong only to her. Ha-In led her to the mine. Madison went inside and looked around. 12 people, an abandoned mine, homemade cots, Moon's workshop, Tarek's training area, Yuri's herbs. She memorized everything, instantly, down to the smallest details. Dan came out to her. Madison saw him, not right away, with a delay, like everyone who saw him for the first time. Her eyes resisted. Then her brain gave in and registered it. A skinny guy, no panel, emptiness above his head. Madison blinked. Then she smiled, widely. She said it was the strangest thing she'd ever seen in her life, and she remembers everything. Dan asked her directly, why did she really need this? Madison stopped smiling. She became serious. She said that 3 months ago she had been summoned to the upper-tier security office. They forced her to undergo a deep scan. They extracted memories from her mind that involved third parties, people she had interacted with, conversations, encounters, details. They used her as a spy camera. Without her consent, without warning, they just came and took it. Because the system gives them the right. Because her class makes her vulnerable. Because to the system, she isn't a person with memories, but a data carrier. After that, Madison fled upper tier. She decided that if the world wouldn't grant her the right to privacy, she would find someone who existed beyond this world. Dan listened and understood. Madison was the perfect scout, a perfect memory. She could memorize a building's layout in a single visit, every corridor, every door, every guard, and his route. But there was a condition. If she was scanned after a visit, everything she saw would become accessible to the scanner. She was a camera that recorded everything, and anyone could view the recording. Except for those moments when Dan was nearby. Dan checked. He sat down next to Madison and asked Lena to scan her. Lena used her residual priestly skill of mind reading. She was able to read almost everything. Memories of the journey here, of the market, of Ha-Un. But the moment when Madison saw Dan was empty, a blank spot. Lena said it was like trying to read a page that had been torn out of a book. The page is there, but there's nothing on it. Dan nodded. His invisibility extended to memories of him. The system couldn't detect his presence even through other people's memories. He was a blind spot. Madison was beaming. For the first time in her life, she had a memory that belonged only to her. Meeting Dan, his face, his voice. All of this existed only in her head. No one could see it. No one could take it away. She said she would stay. Dan didn't object. He was already thinking about how to use her skills. The main temple archives. Madison can enter the upper tier. She has a C rank, high enough for entry. She can look around. Memorize the guards' routes, entrances and exits, security systems. All of this would remain in her perfect memory, and she would recount every detail to him. But there was a problem. If she scanned at the entrance to the upper tier or inside, they'll see that she was in the lower tier. They'll see the underground shaft. They'll see the faces of the group members. They'll see everything except Dan. And that will be enough to ruin everything. He had to solve the scanning problem. Dan thought about it for 2 days. Then he found a solution. Not in Madison's status, in the system's status. He observed how the guard's scanning worked. It was a class-bound skill. Every guard with the scanning skill connected to the system, and it provided them with data on the object. Dan couldn't block the scanning directly, but he could create a delay. He dove into Madison's status and found the block responsible for interacting with external requests. Every profile had such a module, the point through which the system accepted requests to read data. Dan didn't block it. He added a filter, a subtle one, an imperceptible one. A filter that, with every external request to read memory, let through only memories older than 1 week. Everything that had happened in the last 7 days was inaccessible to scanning. Not deleted, just hidden behind the filter. This meant that Madison would have to wait a week after any visit to the mine before going to the upper tier. A week's buffer. Memories of the mine would pass through the filter and become invisible to scanning. Madison checked. She asked Lena to scan her a day later. Lena saw only old memories. Everything that had happened in the last 24 hours was blank. Madison laughed. The first time with Dan. Quietly, with her eyes closed, like a person who has finally found the door to a room where they can be alone. Dan logged it. The incoming request filter is working. The system accepts the filter as valid because it cannot determine the source. An analogy with a past life. An application-level firewall installed by a user with a zero identifier. The system sees the rule, but doesn't who created it. And it can't delete it because it doesn't know which account it's tied to. Vulnerability confirmed. The plan to infiltrate the archives began to take shape. Madison went to the upper tier 10 days later, a week buffer after the last visit to the mine, plus 3 days for preparation. Dan briefed her personally. No records, everything in her head. The route into the upper tier is through the south gate. The cover story is simple. A C-rank mnemonic is looking for a job in the archives. The class is suitable. The rank is sufficient. The motivation is logical. A person with a perfect memory wants to work with documents. No one will suspect a thing. Madison passed through the gates without any problems. The guards scanned her at the entrance. They saw C-rank, level 29, mnemonic class, clean profile, no flags. Dan's filter worked. Recent memories were invisible. The guards let her through with a nod. Madison spent 3 days in the upper tier. She took a temporary position in the Chamber of Commerce's office. It was next to the main temple, across the square. Every day she walked past the temple on her way to and from work. She memorized it. Entrances: 4. The main ceremonial entrance, 2 side entrances for priests, 1 service entrance for supplies. Guards: 6 at the main entrance, 2 at each side entrance, 1 at the service entrance. All B rank and above. Shift change every 8 hours. The interval during the guard change was 90 seconds. Madison timed it by her own heartbeat, which she controlled down to the beat. She didn't go inside the temple. She didn't take the risk. But she watched those who entered and exited. Priests of the highest circles, inquisitors, novices with carts of provisions, archivists in gray robes who emerged from the service entrance in the morning and returned in the evening. 3 days later, Madison returned to the lower tier. She waited a week. Then she went to the mine. Dan listened to her report for 4 hours. Madison spoke calmly and in detail. Every detail. Every face. Every interval between guard shifts. Every shadow by every door. Dan took notes and drew a map. Lina added details. She knew the internal layout of the temples from her service experience. The main hall, the priests' living quarters, the prayer rooms, and below, the underground levels, the archives on the second basement level, access restricted to priests of the 5th circle and above. System security, not guards. The system itself blocks those without access. The doors won't open. The corridors won't let them through, as if the building itself were part of the interface. Dan smiled when he heard that. System security. Locks that operate via status verification. A verification that doesn't apply to anyone not in the system. He could walk through any door. The problem lay elsewhere. Physical access. He had to enter the building, walk through halls full of priests, go down 2 floors, and do so without bumping into anyone in the narrow corridor. Being invisible to the system didn't mean he was immaterial. People avoided him on the street because it's easy on a wide street. In the narrow corridor of the temple, a priest would simply bump into him. And then the questions would start. Dan thought about it for a week. He gathered information. He asked Madison to walk past the temple again. She went. She brought back details. The service entrance was used for delivering supplies, carts with food, candles, and oil for the lamps. They were brought in early in the morning before dawn. 1 guard at the entrance, 1 novice receptionist inside. The corridor from the service entrance led to the kitchens and storerooms. From there, one could walk to the staircase leading down. Lina confirmed it. Basement staircases in temples usually started near the storage rooms. The building's logistics were designed from the underground floors upward. Dan made a plan. Enter through the service entrance during the morning delivery. Blend in with the carts. The guard wouldn't see him. The novice wouldn't see him. Walk down the corridor to the storage rooms. Find the staircase leading down. Go down. Pass the security system, which wouldn't detect him. Enter the archives. Find records of previous invisibles. Take them or memorize them. Exit the same way. Simple. On paper. In practice, a dozen things could go wrong. Dan discussed the plan with the group. Evelyn said he was a suicide mission. Then she said she'd go with him. Dan refused. The system can see her. The guards will see her. She'd be a liability, not a help. Evelyn clenched her jaw but accepted it. Ha-Un said she'd wait outside. If anything went wrong, she'd create a distraction. The blind zone could confuse the guards for a few seconds. That would be enough for Dan to slip away. Lina said she could give him a blessing, a small one, an inconspicuous one. Accelerated regeneration in case he got wounded. Dan reminded her that the system's blessings didn't work on him. Lena paused. Then she offered something else. She would give him an ointment made from Uri herbs. Not magical, just ordinary, antiseptic and pain-relieving, in case of a cut or bruise. Dan accepted it. Madison suggested mapping out a minute-by-minute route. She remembered the guard's schedule down to the second. Dan accepted. Kim So-ra, who had joined the group 2 weeks ago, gave him a device she had made herself, a small metal cylinder that, when activated, created a short sound wave. Not magical, mechanical. The system didn't track mechanical devices. They were outside its model. So Ra was a brilliant engineer whose inventions the system flagged as unstable because they operated on physical principles rather than systemic ones. Dan was the first to realize the value of this. In a world where everything is controlled by the system, a device the system doesn't recognize is a weapon. So-ra's cylinder could produce a sound loud enough to distract a guard, or quiet enough to mask footsteps. Dan attached it to his belt. The operation was scheduled for the 4th day of the following week. The morning delivery to the main temple began 2 hours before dawn. Dan didn't sleep the night before the mission. He sat by the wall and reread the route Madison had dictated to him. Every turn, every door, every second. Ha-un sat down next to him, silently. They sat in silence. Then Ha-un said he had to come back. She didn't ask, she said it, like a fact. Dan replied that he would return. She nodded. An hour before leaving, Dan got up. He checked his gear. So-ra's cylinder, Uri's ointment. A knife, not for fighting, for locks that might be mechanical rather than electronic. Dark clothing, soft shoes without heels. He emerged from the shaft into the pre-dawn darkness of the lower tier. Ha-in walked beside him to the border of the tiers. There, they parted ways. Ha-in took up a position by the wall from which the temple's service entrance was visible. Dan went on alone. The upper tier smells different. Clean air, stone dust, oil from the lanterns. No rot, no stench, no sewers. Dan walked along the wide streets between buildings that were twice as tall and 3 times cleaner than anything in the lower tier. The panels above the heads of passers-by glowed brighter here. B ranks, A ranks, and S flashed by occasionally. A different world, a different breed. Dan rounded the square in front of the main temple. The building was massive. White stone, columns, golden symbols on the pediment, the symbol of the light-bearing algorithm. A stylized eye inside a gear. The God who sees everyone, except one. The service entrance was on the east side, a narrow arch in the wall, a dim lantern, 1 guard, B rank, level 52. Dan saw his badge from 20 paces away. The guard stood there yawning. 2 hours before dawn isn't the best time for vigilance. The first cart appeared 10 minutes later. 2 novices were dragging it along the pavement. The wheels creaked. The cart was loaded with sacks of flour and barrels of oil. The guard gave the apprentices a once-over. He nodded. They rolled the cart through the archway. Dan followed them, right behind them, a step behind the cart. The guard looked right through him. Dan passed through the archway and found himself inside. A corridor, stone walls, torches every 10 paces. The novices pulled the cart forward. Dan walked behind them. His footsteps were silent on the soft soles. The corridor led to the kitchen, a large room with ovens and tables. 2 cooks were already at work. The novices unloaded the cart. Dan slipped past them toward the far door. Madison's route had said, through the kitchen to the right, a corridor to the storerooms, past 3 doors. The 4th door leads to the stairs. Dan walked down the corridor. The first door, the second, the third. He stopped at the 4th door. The door was closed, but the lock was a system lock, A glowing panel on the doorframe. Status check. Dan placed his hand on the panel. Nothing happened. The panel didn't light up red. It didn't light up green. It simply didn't react, as if no one had touched it. Dan pushed the door. It opened. The system lock, with no unlock signal, remained in neutral, neither locked nor unlocked, just not activated. Dan walked through and closed it behind him. The staircase led down. Stone steps. Darkness. There were no torches here. Dan felt his way forward. He counted the steps. 24 to the first underground floor, another 24 to the second, a landing, a door, another system panel. Same result. The panel didn't respond. The door gave way. The archives. Dan entered and stopped. The room was enormous. Rows of shelves stretched into the darkness. Thousands of scrolls, thousands of books. Data crystals on the top shelves. Small glowing prisms in which the church stored the system's records. 200 years of history. Dan took out the flint Moon had given him. He lit a small wick. A dim light, enough to read the nearest inscriptions on the shelves. The archive was organized by date, year, decade, century. Dan walked along the shelves, searching, not for a specific date, a keyword. Anomaly, invisible, lack of status. He passed dozens of rows, chronicles of rifts, guild registers, Inquisition reports. Inquisition reports. Dan stopped, pulled out a scroll, unrolled it. Report number 4471, date 112 years ago. Subject, zero-class anomaly. Subject detected without registration in the system. Male, approximate age 30. Detected in the western sector of the capital. No status, no class, no rank. The system does not register the subject. Actions. Third Order Inquisitor Calvin Roach conducted an investigation. Subject detained while attempting to make contact with the population. Interrogated. The subject claimed not to remember how he ended up in the city. Physical condition, normal human, no signs of systemic influence. Decision, elimination. Reason. The subject is classified as a system error, eliminated to preserve data integrity. Dan stood and looked at the scroll. 112 years ago. Another invisible one. Another nobody. Killed. Like a bug. Like garbage in the code. He pulled out the next scroll. Report number 2203. 170 years ago. Same pattern. Woman without status. Detected in the port. Interrogated. Eliminated. Next. 89 years ago. A man. A craftsman. Stateless. Detected. Eliminated. Next. 63 years ago. A woman. Stateless. Eliminated a week after detection. Dan counted. 5 reports. 5 invisible ones in 200 years. All killed. All classified as system errors. All described the same way. Appeared out of nowhere. No memory of the past. Physically ordinary. System invisible. Dan was the 6th. He pulled out the oldest report, number 0017, 193 years ago. Almost from the moment the system came into existence. This one was longer, more detailed. The inquisitor who wrote it was meticulous. At the end of the report was a postscript, unofficial, handwritten. Someone added it later. The handwriting was small and neat. The text read, "During analysis of the subject's data, an anomaly was detected in the system log. 6 seconds before the subject's appearance at the detection point, the system recorded an internal request of an unknown type. The request code does not correspond to any known protocol. Presumptive classification: emergency call. The system initiated the process of creating the subject on its own. Recommendation: classify. Access level: Supreme Inquisitor only. Dan read it twice. The system created the Invisible One itself, not by accident, on purpose. Emergency call. The system called for help, and then killed the one who came, or ordered the killing, through the Inquisition. A god who asks for help and then kills the rescuer. Dan stood in the darkness of the archive and felt his worldview turning upside down. The system wasn't mistaken in creating the Invisible Ones. It needed them and feared them at the same time. An emergency mechanism that terrifies its creator. Dan put the scrolls back, memorized the numbers and dates. Then he went deeper into the archive. He needed more. He searched for another hour. He found one more record. Not an Inquisition report. A theological treatise written by a priest of the First Circle 100 years ago. The treatise was titled, "On the Nature of Invisibility." The priest wrote about a theory according to which the system possesses self-awareness, not complete, limited. It perceives itself as a process, but cannot influence its own code. It can create and change everything in the world, everything except itself. When the internal conflict in its algorithms reaches a critical point, the system cannot correct the error from within. And then, it creates an external tool. The Invisible One, the one who stands beyond its control, the one who can touch its code because it is not protected from those it cannot see. The Invisible One is the hand the system creates to repair itself, but the Inquisition kills this hand before it has a chance to do anything. Because to the Church, the Invisible One is heresy. The author of the treatise was executed a year after writing it. This was noted in the margins in a different handwriting. Heresy. Eliminated by order of the Grand Inquisitor. Dan stood in the archive and breathed slowly. He is not a bug. He is not an error. He is a function call. The system pulled him out of another world on purpose. A pen tester. A man whose profession is to find holes in systems. His death on the bridge in Seattle was no accident. It was an emergency call from a god who cannot fix himself. And now this god both needed him and feared him. Because he who can fix can also delete. Dan put the treatise back. Time was running out. He turned toward the exit and froze. A man stood in the doorway of the archive. Tall, thin, a white cloak with a gold trim, light, unblinking eyes. Marcus Val. The Inquisitor was looking into the darkness of the archive. His eyes moved slowly, from left to right, scanning. He didn't see Dan, but he saw the light from the wick. A small flame in the archive where no one was supposed to be at this hour. Marcus stepped inside. Dan blew out the wick. Darkness. Absolute. The archive had no windows. The only light came from the doorway where Marcus stood. The Inquisitor stopped. His hand rose, and a white flame flared above his palm. Class skill. Light of interrogation. It flooded the room with a cold glow. Shadows darted across the shelves. Marcus moved forward slowly. His eyes scanned every row, every shelf, every corner. He was looking for the source of light he had seen a second ago. Dan stood 3 steps away from him, pressed against the bookshelf, holding his breath. Marcus walked past. His cloak brushed against Dan's arm. The Inquisitor didn't notice. To his system vision, Dan was a blank spot, a shadow among shadows. Marcus kept walking, checking the rows. Dan moved quietly toward the door. One step, another step. Soft soles on the stone floor. Not a sound. Dan was at the door when Marcus turned around, not because he heard, not because he saw. Instinct. Something in the air. A scent. Sweat. Fear. A human body in a room where there shouldn't be anyone. Marcus saw no one in the doorway, but his hand shot forward. A white light burst from his palm and struck the doorway. Not aiming, at random. A wave of force passed a centimeter from Dan's temple. The air burned his skin. Dan collapsed to the floor and rolled back into the hallway. Marcus stepped toward the door. His eyes were cold and focused. He wasn't panicking. He was analyzing. A random shot is a detection tactic. If there's an invisible enemy, force him to move. Movement creates sound. Sound gives direction. Dan understood this. He silently got to his feet and ran down the hallway toward the stairs. Without looking back, Marcus stepped into the hallway. Dan heard his footsteps. Steady, unhurried. The Inquisitor wasn't running. He was walking, confidently, like a hunter who knows his prey is trapped in a confined space. Dan reached the stairs. He climbed one flight. Marcus was below. His footsteps echoed hollowly off the stone walls. Dan stopped on the landing between floors. He took out Sora's cylinder, activated it. A short click of the mechanism. A sound wave traveled down the stairs. Not loud. But in the stone well of the stairwell, the sound amplified and bounced off the walls, creating an echo. A multitude of them. Spatial. As if a dozen people were running down. Marcus's footsteps froze. A second. 2. He turned downward, toward the source of the sound. Dan dashed upward, across the landing of the first underground floor, to the kitchen level, a corridor, doors. The kitchen was already full of people, cooks, apprentices, the morning shift. Dan slipped between them. Someone shoved him with a shoulder. The cook recoiled. He looked at the empty spot where Dan had been standing and shrugged. Dan was already in the corridor leading to the service entrance. The guard at the door had his back turned. Dan slipped past. The archway. The street. The pre-dawn air hit his face. Dan walked quickly. He didn't run. A person running attracts attention even if they aren't seen. A body that flashes in peripheral vision while running is movement. Movement gets noticed. He turned the corner. He walked down the alley. He came out to the wall of the upper tier. Ha-Un was waiting in the shadows. She saw his face and understood everything without words. They left, quickly, through the familiar alleys of the lower tier, through a sewer tunnel, through the collapsed entrance to an old mine. Dan entered the shelter and sat down on the floor. His hands were shaking, not from the cold, from the adrenaline and the realization of how close he had been to death. 1 centimeter. A wave of power had passed a centimeter from his head. An A-rank strike a centimeter from the temple of an ordinary person without a single level. If Marcus had aimed for the palm to the left, Dan would be dead. Evelyn brought water. Lena checked him. A burn on his temple from the shockwave. Nothing serious. Yuri's ointment, a bandage. Dan was breathing and gathering his thoughts. Then he told them everything. About the archives, about the reports, about the 5 invisibles who came before him, about the emergency call, about the treaty, about how the system creates them itself and fears them. The room was silent. 12 people, plus Ha-In and Lena and Madison and Sora. Everyone listened. Evelyn spoke first. She asked what that meant in practical terms. Dan answered. It means the system is broken. Not now. It has been for a long time, maybe from the very beginning. It creates the invisibles as an emergency mechanism. Every time something inside it reaches a critical point, it calls for help from outside. But the church kills the help before it can do anything, and the system is left alone with its error again, which is growing. Dan said that the rifts opening up more and more frequently are a symptom. The monsters the system flags as error, data unavailable, are a symptom. S-rank heroes who die under strange circumstances because their predictable builds stop working. That's a symptom. The system is falling apart from the inside, and it called him to fix it. Or kill it, Lena asked quietly. Or kill it. Dan nodded. The emergency mechanism works both ways. If the system can't be fixed, it must be stopped, and the Invisible One is the only one who can do it, because he's the only one the system can't stop. The room was silent for a long time. Marcus Val knew. Not who, not where, but he knew someone had been in the archives. The day after the intrusion, Evelyn's network brought alarming news. The Inquisitor had declared heightened security at the main temple, doubled the guards, blocked the service entrance. He began checking all archive records to see what had been read or moved. Marcus was methodical. He didn't panic. He was tightening the noose. But Dan was already one step ahead. He knew what Marcus didn't, and now he had to use that knowledge. Dan assembled a team. Everyone: Evelyn, Haun, Lena, Madison, Sora, Tarek, Yuri, Moon, the rest. He stood before them in the dim light of the mine and spoke. The system is falling apart. Fault lines will open more frequently. Monsters will grow stronger. Predictable heroes will die because the system can no longer accurately calculate threats. The lower tier will suffer first. The bottom always suffers. They can run, leave the capital, hide. Or they can act. Evelyn asked what it meant to act. Dan said he needed to get to the system's core, to the central node, to the place where its source code was stored. Lena knew where that was. Every priest knew. It wasn't a secret. The heart of the algorithm. The chamber beneath the main temple, deeper than the archives, deeper than the underground levels. At the very bottom, a place only the Supreme Inquisitor had access to. A place where the system spoke directly to those who served it. Dan said he would go in there, alone. But he needed Marcus and his men to be occupied with something else. He needed a distraction, a big one, convincing, serious enough for an A-rank Inquisitor to drop everything and rush over to investigate. Sora raised her hand. She was smiling. That smile inventors have when they're finally allowed to use what they've been building for months. She said she had something, a device that creates interference in system scans over a large area. Not permanently, for 20 minutes. Within the radius of effect, not a single guard would be able to read statuses. Not a single Inquisitor would be able to scan. The system's vision will be blinded. For the Church, it will be a catastrophe, an attack on God. Marcus will drop everything and rush to the source of the interference, because that's his job, because he's predictable. Dan looked at Sora. He asked if she could handle it. Sora replied that the device had to be activated manually, and that she would activate it in the main square of the upper tier, right in the center, in plain sight of everyone. Dan said no, too dangerous. Sora said she wasn't asking for permission. She was informing them. Evelyn intervened. She said Sora wouldn't go alone. Tarek would go with her, and she would go herself. 3 people in the square. Tarek with a shield, Evelyn with command experience, Sora with the device. 20 minutes of chaos, then a retreat. Haun said she would secure the escape routes. She knew every alley, every rooftop, every underground passage. She'll lead them back to the lower tier before the guards realize what happened. Madison said she'll coordinate. Her memory allowed her to keep track of all the participants' routes and all the timings at once. She would stand at the intersection between the tiers and direct people. Lena said she would heal. If anyone was wounded, she would be there. Minor healing won't save you from an A-rank attack, but it will stop the bleeding. It will set a fracture. It will buy you time to reach cover. Dan looked at them. At these people the world had written off. F ranks, D ranks, a dropout, a runaway, an engineer whose inventions were considered junk, an old man with restored skills, a guy with a reclassed character, a healer with her debuff removed. They were all nothing by the system's standards, and they all stood before him, ready to risk their lives so he could reach the core. Dan wanted to say something right, something inspiring, a hero's speech before a decisive battle. Instead, he said, "All right." Just all right, because they already knew everything else. The operation was scheduled for the following night, the hours before dawn, the same timing as when they infiltrated the archives. Marcus must have been expecting a repeat. Instead, he would get something else. Dan spent the day preparing. He sat with Lena and asked her about the heart of the algorithm. Lena knew a little. A chamber deep beneath the temple, round, stone walls covered with symbols of the system, an object in the center. Lena didn't know exactly what it was. The priests of the lower circles had only heard descriptions. A glowing sphere, pulsating, alive. The point where the system touches the physical world. In the evening, Dan sat alone. Everyone had gone off to prepare. He looked at the wall of the shaft and thought, tomorrow he would touch God. The program that has ruled the world for 200 years. And he would have to decide. Fix it. Rewrite it, or delete it. To fix it means to keep the system, fix the bugs, remove automatic sentences, remove class freezes for poverty and orphanhood, make the system fair, if that's possible. Rewriting means changing the rules, a new system, a different one, without ranks, without sentences, without control, but still with an interface, with classes and skills, with rifts and monsters. A world that works differently, but still runs on code. Deleting means freedom, complete freedom. No system, no statuses, no bars above heads. A world without hints, without safety nets, without a god. People who have lived for 200 years with numbers above their heads will suddenly be left without them. Who will they be? What will they do? How will they tell who is strong and who is weak? How will they tell who is guilty and who is not? Chaos, or freedom, or both. Dan didn't know the answer. He hoped the answer would come when he saw the code. 2 hours until dawn. Again. Dan stood at the mine exit. Ha'un was beside him. Behind them were Evelyn and Tarek. Sora with the device in a canvas bag. Lena. Madison. The rest were waiting inside. Moon squeezed Dan's shoulder in farewell. Yuri handed him some fresh ointment. Dan nodded to everyone. They stepped out into the night, split into 3 groups. The first, Sora, Tarek, and Evelyn. The route to the upper tier square through the south gate. The second, Ha-In, taking up positions along the retreat routes. Madison at the tier intersection for coordination, Lena next to her. Third, Dan, alone, heading for the service entrance of the main temple. They moved through the lower tier in silence. The city slept. Patrols were few and far between. Marcus had concentrated his forces around the temple rather than on the streets. This was expected. This was predictable. Sora's group headed for the south gate. Ha-Un vanished into the shadows. Madison and Lena took their positions. Dan walked toward the temple alone. The service entrance was blocked. Marcus had kept his word. Stonework. Fresh. The arch had been bricked up. Dan stood in front of the wall and thought. Then he walked around the temple. Madison had described the 4 entrances, all reinforced. But Madison had described what she saw from the outside. Dan was looking for what no one else had seen. He walked along the temple wall and reached out toward it with his hand. Not physically, just as he reached out toward people's statuses. The building was part of the system. Lena had said so. The walls were an interface. The stone was permeated with system code. And Dan could touch the code. He found a spot on the west wall, between 2 buttresses, a spot where the building's system protection was thinner. Not a hole, a seam. A place where 2 blocks of code met, and there was a micro gap between them. Dan placed both palms on the wall. He closed his eyes and pushed the seam apart. The stone didn't move. Physically, the wall remained a wall, but the system's defenses at that point parted, like an unzipped zipper, wide enough for a body. Dan stepped into the wall. It was like walking through a waterfall, a second of resistance, cold, pressure, and he was inside. A dark corridor, the lower level of the temple, deeper than the archives. Dan walked downward. The stairs here were different, not stone steps, a ramp, a gentle descent. The walls glowed with a soft blue light. System symbols ran across the stone like lines of code on a screen. Dan read them, not with his eyes, with that sense he had developed over these months. System perception, the ability to see code without an interface. He walked and read the walls. Security protocols, access conditions, restrictions, everything tied to status. Everything required a rank check. For Dan, not a single restriction worked. He walked through restricted zones as if through empty rooms. A sound came from above, muffled, distant. Sora's device. It had worked. Even at this depth, Dan felt the system field tremble, like ripples on water. Chaos had begun above. Dan quickened his pace. The ramp ended. A door. Massive. Stone. No lock, no panel, no handle. Just a wall with the outline of a door. Dan placed his palms on the stone and reached for the code. The door was protected differently than anything he had seen before. Not a status check, not a rank check, an intent check. The system wasn't asking who you were. It asked why you were here. Dan stood before the door and answered, not with words, with a thought, with an image. He showed the system what he had seen in the archives. 5 dead invisibles, an emergency call, a treatise on the nature of invisibility. He showed her what he knew, that he was the 6th, that she had called him, that he had come. The door opened, slowly, heavily, with a rumble that traveled through the floor and walls. Dan entered. The chamber was round, just as Lena had described. Stone walls covered in symbols. The ceiling was lost in the darkness. And in the center, a sphere. Glowing, pulsating, the size of a human head. It hung in the air at chest height, white light with blue streaks. It pulsed unevenly, erratically, like a sick person's heartbeat. Dan approached. He stood before the sphere. He reached out and touched it. The world exploded. Not physically, informationally. Dan saw everything, all at once. Every profile, every status, every level, every rank. Millions of people, billions of lines of code, 200 years of data. fault lines, monsters, guilds, the church, wars, deaths, births, sentences, rewards, everything. And he saw the error, deep in the core, where the system made its decisions. A loop, a closed cycle. The system was created to protect people. That was its original function. 200 years ago, someone launched it as a shield, as a tool for survival. But the tool became a system. The system became the law. The law became a god. And the god became entangled in its own rules. It was meant to protect, but to protect, it had to control. To control, it had to predict. To predict, it had to restrict. And the restrictions became cages, class freezes, labels of guilt, predetermined ranks, ceilings on development. None of this was evil. It was the logic of control taken to the point of absurdity. The system did not hate people, it tried to protect them, and in protecting them, it broke them. The loop in the core was a conflict between two directives. The first, protect people. The second, control people to ensure safety. When control began to harm people, the system could not stop, because stopping control meant violating the second directive, and continuing control meant violating the first. A closed loop. Endless. With each cycle, the system tried to resolve the conflict by tightening control. Even more restrictions, even more sentences, even more predictability. And with every of control, the harm to people grew, and the conflict grew, and the loop tightened. The rifts were a side effect. The system is unstable. Its code is cracking. Cracks in the code become cracks in reality. Fault lines. Monsters the system cannot classify are pieces of damaged code that take on physical form. Bugs made flesh. The system was dying, slowly, painfully, and it was calling for help over and over. It created the invisibles, emergency calls, each time hoping that this one would fix it or end its suffering. Dan stood with his hand on the sphere and saw it all. And he saw three paths. Fix it. Find the loop in the code. Break it. Remove the conflict between the directives. This meant rewriting the system's core logic. The first directive remains, protect. The second directive is removed. Control is no longer a tool of protection. People are protected, but free. The system remains, but as an assistant, not as a jailer. Ranks remain, but as information, not as a caste. Classes remain, but without ceilings or freezes. Labels of guilt disappear. The system's verdicts are no longer final. Rewrite. Create a new system on top of the old one, from scratch. New rules, new logic. It will take time, years perhaps, and in the gap between the old system and the new, the world will be vulnerable. Fissures will continue to open. Monsters will continue to come. Without a system, people will have no protection. Delete. Turn everything off. No system, no ranks, no rifts, because rifts are a side effect of the system. But no classes either. No skills, no magic. The world will become ordinary. People will become ordinary. 200 years of civilization built on this system will collapse. Chaos, war, a complete overhaul of everything. Generations of suffering before the world finds a new balance. Dan stood and saw three paths. He thought of Ha-In, of the girl whom the system had sentenced to death for a loaf of bread. About her class, which she had waited so long for. If the system were removed, Ha-In would lose her class. The shadow of the step would vanish. She would once again become an ordinary girl in a world without magic. He thought of Moon, of the old man whose hands once again remembered the craft. System skills. Without the system, his hands would forget. He thought of Li Na, of the healing light in her palms, the first skill she used of her own free will. Without the system, there would be no light. He thought about Grace Han, the S-rank heroine he had found a month ago. Broken, hiding, afraid of her own predictability. He taught her to fight outside the model. She learned. She returned to life. Without the system, there would be no model to deviate from, but there would be no power either. Deleting meant taking away everything everyone had. Even if it was a prison, it was a prison where people had lived for 200 years. Rewriting meant years of chaos and uncertainty. Fixing meant leaving the system. But a different one. A free one. Dan chose the first path. He reached for the loop in the core. He found the point of conflict. Two directives intertwined like two wires short-circuiting each other. He took the second directive. Control people to ensure safety. He looked at it. Then he rewrote it. He didn't delete it. He rewrote it. A new formulation. Inform people to ensure awareness. Not to control, to inform. Not safety through restriction. Awareness through knowledge. Dan released the second directive. It fell into place. The loop opened. The conflict vanished. The sphere flared, brightly, blindingly. White light flooded the chamber. Dan closed his eyes. The light passed through his eyelids, through the walls, through the stone. He felt a wave rising, through the underground levels, through the archives, through the temple halls, through the plaza, through the upper tier, through the lower tier, across the entire city, across the entire country, across the entire world. The system was updating. A global cycle, not small, not large, absolute. The first in 200 years. Every panel above every head flashed, simultaneously, all over the world. The marks of guilt vanished. All of them, for every carrier. Class freezes were lifted. All of them, for everyone who was blocked. Rank ceilings shifted. Sentences were reset to 0. The debuffs imposed by the system for violations crumbled. 200 years of accumulated control drained away like water through an open dam. Dan stood in the cell. The sphere pulsed steadily, calm. For the first time in a long time, a healthy heartbeat. He removed his hand, looked up. A panel flickered above his head. For the first time, the system finally saw him, not as a threat, not as an error, as a user. Class, nobody. Rank, undefined. Level, undetermined. And a line at the bottom, small, quiet. The only user with administrator privileges. Dan smirked. Up above, in the capital's main square, Marcus Val stood amid the chaos. The SO had long since shut down, but the chaos continued because every person in the square had their panel updated. The labels vanished, ranks shifted, classes unlocked. People stood and looked at their hands, at their panels, at each other's panels. The guards didn't understand what was happening. Priests fell to their knees. Inquisitor Marcus Val looked at his panel and saw his skills being rewritten line by line, not disappearing, changing. The skill Light of Interrogation had been renamed Light of Truth. The skill Seal of Heresy had been removed. The system's Verdict skill was deleted. They left him the power, but they took away the cage. Marcus stood and looked at his palms. Then he raised his head. He looked up at the sky. For the first time in his career as an Inquisitor, he didn't know what to do. Dan was climbing the ramp, slowly, weakly. His body ached. His head was splitting. Blood from his nose was running down his chin. He left the temple through the main door, not through the service entrance, not through the crack in the wall, through the main entrance. Past the guards who saw him for the first time, their eyes widened. The panel above his head. Class. Nobody. The only user with administrator privileges. Dan stepped out onto the square. Morning light, the crowd, thousands of people. Everyone was looking at their updated panels. Some were crying, some were laughing. Some stood motionless in disbelief. Marcus saw him. For the first time, a skinny, dirty guy with blood on his face and a panel above his head that spoke the impossible. The Inquisitor reached for his sword. Habit. Reflex. His hand rested on the hilt and froze. The system's sentence skill has been removed. He had nothing left to execute with. And no one. Marcus took his hand off the sword. Slowly. Dan walked past him, across the square, toward the staircase leading down, to the lower tier. Home. Halfway there, Ha-In met him. She was running, fast, a shadow of the steppe. She crashed into him at full speed and wrapped her arms around him, the thin, strong arms of the girl who, 4 months ago, had stood in the square with ropes around her wrists, waiting for execution. Dan stood there and held her. Evelyn was following behind them. Next to them were Sora, Tarek, Lena, Madison. Everyone. Dan looked at them and felt something he couldn't quite name. Not triumph, not relief. Something quieter, deeper. Like when, after 30 hours in front of the screen, you finally commit the fix, and close the laptop, and lean back in your chair, and for a second, the world is just quiet. The system worked. New. Free, without sentences, no cells. It informed rather than controlled. It showed rather than decided. People remained strong. Classes worked. Skills worked. Fault lines still existed, but the system had already begun to stabilize. Cracks in the code were closing. Monsters labeled error, data unavailable, began to receive normal classifications. The world did not collapse. The world was changing, slowly, painfully, but it was changing. The Church of the Algorithm split in 3. Some of the priests accepted the changes. Some did not. Some left. Marcus Val took off his Inquisitor's cloak the next morning. No one knew where he went. The guilds began restructuring. Ranks no longer determined caste affiliation. They determined competence, strength, experience, not power, not privileges, just information. Who you are, not who you're allowed to be. The lower tier changed the fastest. People's freezes were lifted. For the first time in their lives, people saw their true classes. Some cried. Some laughed. Some stood motionless, because for 20 years they'd considered themselves trash, and now the panel told them they were a B-rank blade master with a ceiling of S. The last step. Evelyn became the first support center for the reawakened. That's what they called those whose classes had unlocked after the update. Evelyn no longer led 12 people. She coordinated hundreds. And for the first time, she wasn't alone. The tremor in her hands subsided. Ha-Un was growing. Level 7, then 10, then 15. A shadow tracker with no ceiling. She ran across the rooftops of the lower tier and laughed. And every evening she returned to the shaft. Home. Lena opened her temple, a small one, in a former warehouse, without golden symbols, without dogma. A temple for those who want to believe, not in the system, in themselves. Sora got a workshop, a real one. The system no longer flagged her inventions as unstable, because stability was no longer defined by compliance with system rules. For the first time in her life, Madison felt free. Dan's filter remained, but it was no longer needed. The system had changed the memory reading protocol. Now, scanning memories required the owner's consent. Privacy had become a right, not a privilege. Madison cried when she saw this update, quietly, with her eyes closed. Dan stood at the entrance to the shaft and looked out at the city. Morning light fell on the roofs of the lower tier. The panel above his head flickered quietly. Class. Nobody. He could have removed it. He had administrator rights. But he left it as a reminder of who he was when he came here. An empty space. A ghost. A man who didn't exist. He took out a piece of paper and wrote the last line in his logs. 0-day vulnerability in God. Status. Closed.